Hello and welcome to the Albion Obsessed podcast. You join us on this very special edition where we talk to former chairman Dick Knight. Dick, it is an absolute pleasure and a privilege to have you on the show today. How are you doing, my friend?
Well, thanks, guys. I do appreciate that. I'm very well. I'm 84, but I feel like 44. So I'm doing well, and I'm very busy. Uh, Involved in football still, believe it or not. I'm proud to be, obviously the president of the Albion, life president. Where we are today is I always knew we could get there. We would get there as long as we had the stadium. So I'm only delighted where we are in the hierarchy of football at the moment. We can never take anything for granted. Clearly, we've got some difficult immediate future times coming up while Roberto gets his feet under the table, so to speak. Um, but yeah, I'm very well and very delighted to be invited onto your show.
Thank you, Dick. I'm going to say it's a genuine privilege to chat to you tonight. We're going to quiz you about some things. I'm sure you've heard many of our questions before, but we'd be, as I say, we'd be delighted if you could share your wisdom and your
Well,
insight.
I hopefully will give you different answers. How about that?
Oh, that would be lovely. Thank you. But we do like, Dick, to start the show with three questions. We ask these questions to every guest we have just to help build our understanding of yourself as a football fan. So, Joe, would you like to take it away?
Of course. So, do you remember your first Albion game? I'm sure you've been to thousands, and so if you can't, don't worry. But do you remember the first one, the one that made you fall in love with it?
Yeah, my dad came back from the Second World War. That's how old I am. And I was actually 8 years of age then. So I didn't get the privilege of my grandchildren or any of you guys who may have gone when you were, like I took my eldest grandchild when he was 18 months old. So I wanted to get him into the seagull's ways as soon as possible, and the rest of my grandchildren along the similar lines. But my dad came back from the Second World War, where he survived it. He was a pilot, and he told me many years later that one of the things that kept him going was taking his little boy to the Albion, because he was an Albion fan himself before the war, before the Second World War. So when he didn't get back because he was in the Far East until 1946. So, and there we were, bottom of Division 3 South, or near the bottom. And he took me, to the ground, and we went to the East Terrace. And I remember, going through the turnstile, but going up this slope to the top of the terraces through this, muddy and sort of rock-strewn approach to the terraces. But as I crested the top of the terrace, I looked down and saw this green sward of grass with little figures running around in blue and white stripes. And we were playing Mansfield Town, right? Um, and we, believe it or not, won this game 5-1, although we were near the bottom of the league. And that's, that was, I was open-eyed in wonderment at this incredible panoply, this of sporting activity. And, immediately I was in love with the Albion. That was it, So my first game was in 1946. So that tells you how old I am. And I've probably seen an average of 30 games a season, because I've been to loads of, I've been virtually to every ground where the Albion have played away. So do the math. It's got to be 2,000 games or something like that, at least. And then, of course, here we are, at the when imagine year after year, when I was a fan, I started as a boy fan, we were sort of scraping around the bottom of Division 3 South. The idea of ever getting out of that league at the time was remote, but we gradually we signed a player when I was in the first season I was there, or second season, called Johnny McNichol, who was a Scottish player who played for Newcastle. We're in the third level. He came to Brighton from the first. He was a regular player in the first 11 at Newcastle, but they just bought this star player, Len Shackleton, at that time for a world record fee of £13,000. £13,000. That was the whole fee, not the day's wages of what some players get these days. And he came to Brighton because in those days, I'm probably boring you, but in those days the clubs had the contract of the players, but they only paid them during the season. They didn't pay them anything in the close season, but they kept their contract. So the players couldn't go off to another club. Anyway, he was told, Johnny McNichol, he told me this years later. I mean, I never met him until I was the chairman of the Albion. And he told me that he was called into the boardroom by the Newcastle chairman and said, Johnny, I'm bringing in Len Shackleton from the deadly rival Sunderland, and you won't be playing in the first team. I've got two clubs that are already interested in you. One is Manchester City, who were in the first, as it was then, the first division, and there's this other club called Brighton and Hove Albion, down on the south coast. And so Johnny says, yeah, but they're in the League 3, Division 3, aren't they? So he says, yeah. But those days, all the players got the same wages because it was a maximum wage. So he was reassured by the chairman of Newcastle that he would be paid the maximum wage by Brighton. So his wife, he just got married, and his wife said, well, Brighton, he was a Scot, and he was from the north of Scotland somewhere. So, she quite fancied the idea of living in Brighton rather than Manchester. So she persuaded him to go and talk to the Brighton chairman after him talking to Man City. And of course, basically, what clinched it for him to come to Brighton was that the Brighton chairman at the time was a builder. He had a building company. Alec Witcher, I think was his name, Alec Witcher. And he said to Johnny, how about this? I will pay you a labourer's wages in the summer, on top of it. I mean, because there's no football. So most of the players had to get a job anyway, But so he was guaranteed this wages, which was probably more than he got from the football club. And he didn't have to turn up. So he came to play at Brighton, and he was absolutely brilliant player. He stayed with us, I think, 3 seasons or 2 seasons. He went to Chelsea for a then virtually record fee. The next season, they won the league for the first and only time until Mourinho turned up 60 years later, right? And he was a regular in that. He was played full. They had 42 games in that at that time. Johnny played 41 of them, so he was that good. He was immediately into the Chelsea team. So, my early days were of watching a truly. I would put him in my all-time Albion team. He was that good. And let's face it, there's some great players in that all-time Albion team. So, sorry, that's the answer to your first question, Joe.
That was so fascinating listening to that. I'm not going to lie, I was engrossed in everything you were saying there, Dick. So what we were saying there with over 2,000 plus games you must have gone to, you just picked on it. Johnny would have made your first Albion 11. Any other standout names during your time as a fan or even as chairman?
Well, I have to go to probably the best signing I ever made, which was Bobby Zamora, you know, without a doubt. And so he's up there. So is Glenn Murray. I bought Glenn Murray against the wishes of the then manager. I insisted on us buying him. I knew what I was looking at. I paid 300,000 to Rochdale. We were a League One club, and 300,000 is a lot of money for a League One club to play a League Two, to pay a League Two club. But I knew what I was looking at, and I went with the scouts to watch Glenn several times, and I knew how good he was. I knew he would play at the top level. But the same with Bobby, because with Bobby, he was more of a talismanic character, because he, you know, we saw him, Mickey Adams and I, and when we were looking at another player, and we were coming back up the M4, and I said to Mickey, keep an eye on that, you know, that guy from Bristol Rovers reserves, have him watched. And about a month later, 6 weeks later, he said, I've got that boy. We've got him in on loan. He's going to be with us for a month. Well, in that time, Bobby scored 6 goals, right? And at the end of it, we obviously wanted to extend his loan, and he said no. He said, he's such a good professional, Bobby Zamora. He said, no, my club is Bristol Rovers, and I'm sure the manager, who was Ian Holloway of all people, will have seen that I've scored 6 goals and hopefully will give me a chance. Because he hadn't played in Bristol Rovers' first team at that time, and he never did. Because what happened, so Mickey and I were obviously quite upset that he didn't want to stay with us. But I said to Mickey and the board that I'm going to try and sign Zamora at the end of the season, which I did, and they turned me down flat, because they wanted, believe it or not, £250,000, Bristol Rovers, for a player that had never been in their first team. And what it was, they produced in the previous 3 or 4 years a raft of good strikers. So they were selling them for £250,000. So they thought, you know, I can get £250,000 for Zamora. This is what the chairman thought. And, you know, I said to him, don't be mad. You know, we're in League Two. We can't pay that sort of money for a player. So I made an offer, which was, I went up to 100,000, right, which was way above what I was planning to spend. And he turned me down, the chairman. So I said to Mickey, you know, they'll be back, they'll come back, because I've offered them 100,000 quid, you know, which is, so we get to the season. If you all recall, we were allowed in friendlies a season. We got to within 1 week before the start of the season with a friendly. That was the only time we were allowed to go there, other than playing league, you know, the actual games. So in that game, Gary Hart, you know, we were desperate to get Zamora, and I'd said to Mickey Adams, they'll be back. Bristol Rovers, the chairman, Jeff Dunsford, will be on to me. So we played this, we got all the way through to a week before the start of the season. Gary had to play up front because we didn't have a centre forward against Des Walker. It was against Notts Forest, and he was the England centre half. And Gary scored 2 goals in this game. And Mickey came into the boardroom afterwards, where, you know, boardroom with him. What a joke, you know, it was about as big as the room I'm in now. And he said, well, Mr. Chairman, so, yeah, what happened to that bloke Zamora? I thought he was going to be with us by now. So I said to him, Mick, you know, you're absolutely right. It was Saturday afternoon. I said, if I don't get a call from the Bristol Rovers chairman by 10 o'clock Monday morning, I will get on to him. But that I will be then at a huge disadvantage, because I'm chasing them. At 9:45 on the Monday morning, I get this phone call from Bristol Rovers, from the chairman. It was incredible. So Jeff Dunsford says to me, Dick, are you still interested in the lad Zamora? So I said, thinking quickly, I'm not sure. I don't know. I'll have to speak to my manager. Right? So I'm playing it sort of nonchalantly, and I'll ring you back when I've got hold of him in 10 minutes time or so. I knew they were all in. So because I never even rang Mickey, because I knew what his answer would be. He would have bitten my arm off, right? So I rang the chairman of Bristol Rovers back, and I said, yeah, he thinks, yeah, he still is quite interested in him. So I said, so I've offered you at 100. He said, oh no, he said the price is 250. So I said to him, I said, why are you wasting my time? I've told you 5-6 weeks ago that you're just annoying me now because you're trying to get £250,000 for him. And he said, well, I said, is he even going to figure in your squad, for the coming season? Because he said Ian doesn't really, reckon him as a striker. He thinks he might be a left-sided midfield player, right? So I'm sort of like, thank God we didn't have Zoom in those days, because he would have seen me, hooting with laughter, the idea that he was a midfield player. I said, look, is it your manager who can't make up his mind? So he said, yeah. I said, give me his number. Can I ring it? Would you mind if I ring it? So I got on the phone to Holloway, how old it is, with his Bristolian accent. He said, that's young Zamora. He'll never make it as a striker, but I think he could be, a midfield player, left-sided midfield player. So I said, well, my manager, Mickey, Mickey Adams, he's got this thing about, he thinks he could be a striker. Like, he scored 6 goals in 6 games, for God's sake. What more did Holloway want? So he said, I said, but it's ridiculous. Your chairman wants £250,000. I'm not paying that. So he said, well, what would you pay? I said, well, I've already, doesn't he said, because he told me that you'd pay 100,000. I said, that's the figure I'm prepared to pay. He said, I'd go for that. I said, well, will you speak to your chairman? Because Mickey wants to give the lad a chance, as a striker. And because all of this has gone on, Mickey Adams doesn't know that I'm having all these conversations. So in the end, Dunsford 10 minutes later rings me and said, okay, we'll take 100, and I gave him a pretty generous sell-on fee percentage, because I just was desperate to get this signing over the line. And then I phoned Mickey, and he didn't know anything about it up to then. And I said, guess what? I said, Zamora's coming in later this afternoon for a fitness test. And he virtually dropped the phone, Mickey, because he was so delighted. And that's how we got Bobby Zamora. But it was, he turned out to be, well, he was even better than we expected. He was, I think what he symbolised on the pitch, what we were doing off the pitch in terms of team, to get our club on the right road for the future, obviously get the stadium. But he was a talismanic player, Bobby, because, Mickey wanted to play initially 4-4-2. And, and I said, well, he started out playing 4-4-2, and it didn't work because we sort of were too defensive. And Bobby at that time hadn't really started. It was basically he wanted to play 4-4-2, but we crowded the midfield and didn't really give our sort of attacking a speed of response, a sort of, on the counter type of attacking. So we went to 4-3-3, but really we played 4-5-1. All you had to do is get the ball up to Bobby Zamora, and he would hold it up and bring other players into it, whether it was Gary Hart on the right or Ozzy, Paul Ozzy, left winger from Fulham. And so we were so tight defensively because we had 5 across the middle and 4 at the back, and Bobby. That was all we needed. And so Bobby was a wonderful. So he inspired all the other players to play at their very best because he was so good. So he was a very inspirational leader on the pitch, and that team was full of leaders, absolutely full of leaders. And I mean, they won 2 leagues in a row, didn't they? I mean, that's how good they were. More recently, obviously, one of the players that has stood out for me at the Amex was Vicente, the Spanish winger who only was there with us for about a year. He was absolute quality. He could thread a pass through 3 or 4 defenders, and he did that regularly. But what happened with him, his wife didn't like living in England, and he really wanted to play. I mean, we were in the Championship then, but he really wanted to play in the Premier League, and he was obviously good enough to play in the Premier League. In the end, he went back to Spain. There's been some wonderful defenders. Going back to when I was young, a player called Roy Jennings, who came from Swindon, wonderful defender. Gary Stevens, and of course I mentioned, Lawrenson or Ward, who were, at their time they were world-class players playing in Division 3 South. That's how good they were. I remember in my ad agency, we had offices all over Europe, and I was telling German people that we had a player at Brighton in League 3 who was as good as Beckenbauer, and he was, because he did the same thing as Beckenbauer. He played in the back and brought the ball forward, and often went to the opposition penalty area. Nobby Horton, who, as you know, became one of my many managers, told me that when he was the captain, he was the anchor midfield player in that team. He said, Loro would sail past him, and and he used to shout to Horton, lock it up at the back, Skip, words to that effect. In other words, you stay back because I'm going forward, so you make sure we. And of course, that was a wonderful team. And of course, Ward was as good in his time as Zamora was in his time. They were both outstandingly good players, and deserved to play, both of them, at 20 games for England, each of them. They deserve to be in the England team regularly, but neither of them were. And it's because in Zamora's case, he went. He if you remember, his best season at the top level was when he was at Fulham, and they got to the Europa Cup final. And Roy Hodgson, who was the manager of Fulham at the time, I mean, Bobby had this ankle injury, and he asked him to play, on with painkillers and a jab, whatever, and to get through at least a half of the game, to try and nick a goal and then defend it. But what he did that, Bobby, but it stopped him going to South Africa in the World Cup. Otherwise, he would have been England's centre forward in the World Cup. Any other players that I mean, there's loads. Obviously, there's loads, but I don't know how long this podcast goes on. How long have we got? How long
It
have we
goes
got?
on as long as you
as
want
long
it
as you like to
No,
speak.
no,
Honestly, we're just absolutely captivated by hearing these stories, and that's exactly what our fans want to hear as well. So we really appreciate it.
My
Yeah,
dear wife has just brought me a nice cup of coffee, so I'm
oh, thank
ready.
you.
I'm here to go for a while. Yeah.
Oh, that's what we like to hear. Fantastic. Now, Dick, you've already mentioned it to us off air, but just for the benefit of our listeners and viewers, if you had to pick one of your top Brighton shirts, what would it be, please?
Well, for listeners, Tom is sitting in front of the red and black skint shirt. Presumably, they can't see it. Are they?
They can see it on YouTube, but we also do it on Spotify.
Well,
so
that was one of my favourite shirts for two reasons. One, Bobby wore it. He scored a lot of away goals in all the time. He wasn't just a home ground player. And I remember him scoring two wonderful goals. One at Bury, a sad club that went under, where he volleyed it over the goalie's head from about 40 yards out. It came over his shoulder and he volleyed it. And then he scored another great goal where he ran from the halfway line at Chesterfield and scored, another great goal wearing that. And it was almost as popular as the blue and white striped shirt when it was out. And then obviously the one that Tom is wearing, which is the centenary shirt with that wonderful skint logo, the ellipse. And I was saying that when I met up with the skint guys who were based in Brighton, obviously, and I wanted a local company, but I knew that they were distributed worldwide by Sony, and Norman was their top star. And so I persuaded them in that first meeting to drop the word records from their logo, and it was because I said we'll get far more publicity, with just having skint on it, because we are what it says on the shirt, just like that paint product, whatever. I can't remember. I'm in advertising, but I can't remember what the brand was. So not very effective advertising. But in our case, we were what it said on the shirt. And so we started off the season, and about the second away match was at Barnet. This is in League Two. And guess what? They were sponsored by the magazine Loaded, right? So there they were in the tunnel before the game. The players that you see on television, they're kind of snarling at each other. Occasionally, one of them knows. And normally, there's a lot of macho posturing, going on in the tunnel before the game. In this case, they're all looking at each other, and they all started. There was this amazing amount of laughter coming from the tunnel. And when they came onto the pitch, the players walking alongside each other, they're all killing themselves laughing. And I'd arrange, this is at Barnet, I'd arrange for the photographers to take a joint picture of all the players together rather than each team on its own, So right across there's this wonderful, landscape picture of the teams, both teams, skint loaded. And of course, that got in the Sunday papers, several of the Sunday papers. It was just a way, it kind of symbolized the way I felt about football. I love football, and we should be happy about it, not in a somber mood, which Albion fans understandably were when I took over. Everyone's spirits were down. The players' spirits were down. All the staff spirits were down. And I wanted to change all that. And I think the skint sponsorship was incredibly significant. And, and that lasted 9 years, which is a long time for a shirt sponsorship. And Norman, of course, wore that shirt from the beginning. He, I remember concerts in Japan. He was in front of, 20,000 people. One of the standout ones was at the Copacabana beach in Rio, in front of 250,000 fans wearing that shirt. And then Norman have kept that tradition going, as most of you know. He launched this season's shirt. Brilliant, that continuity. And there's Norman still doing his thing. On Brighton Beach recently, where I was there. I mean, he's a big pal of mine. Wonderful, and there's the Albion being part of his community, which to me has always been one of the driving forces of what I wanted to do when I was chairman. And I'm very proud of Albion in the community and how we built that up. Anyway, that's another story.
You mentioned just as you were speaking then about the times in the 90s and the somber mood that was around before you took over. So can we talk about that a little bit? Just like your perspective on how it was for you as a fan watching on, and sort of maybe what drove you to want to take over.
Well, Joe, it was really, I was watching mainly at long distance because I was in America a lot at that time in my company. I was backwards and forwards across the Atlantic all the time. One year I had 88 immigration stamps in my passport, which showed you that I was in America 3 times every fortnight. So I would often fly into Heathrow on a Saturday morning, come down to my home in Hove and go walk across to the Goldstone. And I could see this whole thing, deteriorating in a depressing way. And but I wasn't, really active in it. I couldn't take an active role in it. I was just getting more and more angry about it. And then Liam Brady, who was at that time still the manager, approached me through my brother-in-law and asked me if I could help. He could see what Archer and Co were up to, and he asked me if I could help. And at that time, I couldn't, because my wife had become ill with cancer, my first wife, and so I couldn't do anything about it, and because obviously she was the absolute priority. And then a few months after she died, he came back to me. By this time it was, I think it was April '96, and said, Dick, this has gone. By that time he'd already resigned, because he wasn't taking any more of it, by the way they were running the club. And, basically he said to me, it's now or never. If you can help, then we need that help now. And so I actually suggested, to Liam that do you remember when we had that last game against York and the fans came on the pitch and all the Sunday papers reported it as football hooliganism? That really riled me, because it wasn't football hooligans, it was fans protesting about the way their club was being run. And that's what really, I thought, I'm going to get involved in this, and I'm going to save our club with the help of the fans. We're all in this together. And so that was what spurred me. It was Liam, and I knew, because initially my consortium consisted of myself, Liam, who was going to be the director of football, and my financial guy from my agency, my ad agency in London, who was, he and I were at school together in Brighton, in Hove Grammar School. And he was a big Brighton fan as well. I used to meet him on the East Terrace, and please excuse me. And he, Bob Pinnock, his name, And so the consortium was me, Liam, and Bob Pinnock. And Martin Perry joined later. That was several months later, although Martin was involved because he was working for McAlpine at that time. And to be honest, McAlpine, they knew there was a new stadium needed to be built, and they didn't care who the chairman was. In a sense, they just wanted to build a stadium, so they were interested. Martin worked for them, and he was doing his job. And I later appointed him as our chief executive because he knew all about stadium planning, so he was a very good acquisition for me. And so the point is that that consortium of me, Liam, and Bob Pinnock, that was it, And what happened, of course, Liam then got approached by David Dean, who was the vice chairman at Arsenal, but was very much the man in charge of Arsenal, who came to him, and then he came to me, and he wanted Liam to take over the job of director of youth development at Arsenal. Well, it's a bit like, me being asked to go back to Brighton when I've been somewhere other club. Of course I'd go. And Liam was being asked to be director of worldwide youth development. So of course I didn't stand in his way, and nor should I have done. David Dean became a very good friend of mine because, he knew what I was giving up, what we were giving up. But so it was really initially just me and Bob Pinnock, and then Martin, as I say, joined, in that interim period while we were getting under the table, beginning to put some plans in place. We were one of the first clubs to embrace the internet revolution. We had a website way ahead of most clubs, and a guy called Ian Andrews, who also lives in Brighton, who worked in my agency, became an IT expert. I employed him, and so we were streets ahead of most clubs on that. So I was bringing new ideas into the game. I knew that the conventional press media, was on its way out. I mean, it would not be as predominant as it was then. I knew it was going to be, the TV was going to just grow and grow and grow in terms of TV rights. All of that I was predicting long before it happened, because one of my clients was Rupert Murdoch in my ad agency. I did the advertising for the Times and the News of the World, which were two papers and the other two, the Sun and the Sunday Times, were handled by another ad agency. So when he came and started talking about launching Sky, he talked to people like me about the best way to go around launching Sky. And I was one of the people that said to him, forget about taking on the BBC in news or drama or comedy. Sport is where you should go, and football in particular, because I knew all about football, and I knew that they were giving away what limited TV coverage there was in football. The people running football didn't have a clue what it was worth, and I did, because I came from the commercial, TV background. So it was a incredible time of change, and but I would say singly it was Liam Brady that I owe it to, and all Albion fans that owe it to, blame him for getting me involved.
And thank God he did, because who knows what would have happened if he hadn't have done so. So Dick, you talked a little bit about some of those happy with Dean memories, especially with the likes of Bobby Zamora and later Glenn Murray. But there are 2 years that often get somewhat overlooked, and maybe it's because we played home games in Kent, and they were the years at Gillingham. So talk to us a little bit about those 2 years.
The place in Kent that dare not speak its name, as John Bain called it. Brilliant.
I mean, how much pressure was there on you to get the club back to Brighton at the time? Obviously, fans and players making such a huge trip, very difficult. I mean, we chatted to Brian Horton in the summer, and he gave us his views on it, how tricky it was. So, what was your perspective on it?
Well, first of all, you know, when we had that last game at the Goldstone, it was pretty, catastrophic from the club's point of view, apart from the result of the game. But in terms of leaving the ground and having to travel, 1,000,000 miles to Gillingham, I mean, surely the furthest ground share in the history of football worldwide, let alone certainly in England. And so but what not that many people realise is that the football league at that time did nothing to help us. What they imposed. So I've tried to organise a ground share at Crawley, which is obviously far more convenient for all of us. And we would offer Crawley a 10,000 capacity ground. They'd just built the Broadfield Stadium, which held 4,000. And I was offering them a 10,000 stadium, which we would pay for. But their council turned it down. The club were only too happy. And the council turned it down for political reasons. They were all die-hard left-wing socialists from the old era. And of course, Brighton was one of the major towns that went Labour, certainly Hove, when Hove went Labour in that 1997 election, that's when Blair said, we've won, because when Hove went Labour, so they were new Labour people in Brighton and Hove. And it was nothing to do with football. It was to do with two sets of the same political party going up against. So that fell through, right? So what the FA did, what the Football League, not the FA, did, they said, right, you've got to play at, and also Millwall, I tried to organise the ground share there. And I got on very well with their chairman, Theo Pafitis. And that would have been also 1,000,000 times better than going to Gillingham. But the league turned that down because they wanted us to go to Gillingham. They said, made that arrangement. I didn't make it. It was Archer that made that arrangement. But then to cap it all, the Football League, in their wisdom, said to me, we're going to impose a performance bond on you, a £500,000 performance bond. And if you don't come back to Brighton within 3 years, we're going to keep that £500,000, right? Now, can you imagine? This is in 1997 when, and I had to give them £500,000 to sit in their bank account, and that was their way of helping Brighton. Unbelievable, and so that made me even more focused, as if I wasn't already, on getting the club back to Brighton. I hated going to Gillingham, as all of us did. But I went there because that's what we had to do. Scally was never there because he was always at their away matches, which are obviously Gillingham were playing wherever they were playing. So I never actually had any dealings with Scally. The one who did that deal was Bellotti, and no doubt he was patted on the back by Archer for doing it because it was almost as far away from Brighton as it was possible to be, except that there was a character called Michael Knighton, who was, no relation to me, but Michael Knighton, who was the chairman of Carlisle United, right? And he tried to take over and almost succeeded in taking over Manchester United. Knighton did, right? Those of you who know your football will know this guy, almost succeeded in taking over Manchester United. But when he didn't, he said, I've got a good idea. He said, to really make some publicity, why don't we offer you a ground share at Carlisle? I said, yeah, Michael, it will be good for publicity once, But then, you know, what do you expect my fans to do? Traipse all the way up to Carlisle for a home game and then play the. I mean, even at Gillingham, we had away games that were nearer to Brighton than our home games. All the London ones were nearer to Brighton. I mean, it's bizarre. So I absolutely determined to get the club back as quickly as possible. And I remember when you drove into Gillingham, it said, "Welcome to Gillingham." And I used to say, "Yeah, you are bloody welcome to Gillingham as far as I'm concerned." You know, and so Brian Horton came in very difficult circumstances there. And he started rebuilding the team, you know, which is what I wanted, obviously. And we started beginning to perk up. And by the time, so I managed to, I mean, this is where the fans came into it, you know, bring Albion back to Brighton. The council weren't in the slightest bit bothered about it. They thought Brighton would just die. The Albion would die at Gillingham. That's what they thought. And they weren't bothered. It was only when we started showing the power of the fans in voting terms is when the politicians all of a sudden woke up to the fact that here was a lot of voters and they are angry, you know, and then they started getting involved. But up to that point, Brighton and Hope they were two separate councils in the early days. You know, so they weren't interested in the Albion at all. There was no culture, football culture, in this part of the world the way there is in the north. And so I had to fight that lethargy with numbers and action and innovation. And that's where the fans were brilliant. You know, so many good, interesting people in the fan. Every club got it. But I made a point of finding out what we had. So I did one of the first things I did when I took over was to do a survey of the fan base, where they lived, because I was certain that only about probably, you know, under 50% actually came from Brighton and Hove because of the, you know, the catchment area of the Albion being the only at that time league club in Sussex. But also the demographic of and what they did. So, you know, we went from I was going to say astronauts, but it wasn't astronauts. It was accountants. But we did have zoologists, and in between we had rocket scientists. An amazing range of people, you know, whose their daily work was something that was could be valuable to us. So we had this this group of fans who were actively willing to help. And then when you started making people aware that, you know, we want to use this because we've got that, the other thing I did was I told the fans what I was doing. You know, we had various meetings at the Hove Town Hall, the place on the seafront, you know, what's that club? Not the Comedia, but you know, the Concord on the seafront. I remember David Davis, my good friend David Davis from the FA, who came down and thought the fans were going to tear him limb from limb. But he was the one who helped set up the mediation that eventually unseated, you know, Archer, David Davis. The FA were useless. Graham Kelly, who was the chief executive at the time, was only interested in the publicity of standing on we had 2 or 3 FA meetings where they was trying to sort things out, and they just let Archer get away with it. But David Davis was sitting there, was aware that something had to be done. And in the end, we went to mediation. And I mean, again, unheard of in football history. So they put this proposition an Archer that each of you will have a mediator and you won't actually meet each other. The mediators will meet, and that's how they do it. So I agreed to it. I thought it was a good idea. Archer thought I can get some publicity out of this or whatever. So he did it. He agreed to do it. And these two mediators that we were given had both just come off a diplomatic mediation about land in the Gaza Strip. You know, an incredibly volatile Middle Eastern mediation, and then they came to the Albion mediation. I mean, we were sort of in all sorts of ways breaking new ground. It was just incredible, and the final straw with them was. Do any of you remember this program that Meridian Television put out, the future of the Goldson or the end of the Goldson or whatever? They put out a live program on a Sunday afternoon from their studios in Southampton. I think it's Meridian or whatever the ITV company is concerned. Do any of you remember that?
So there's a vague recollection. I'm pretty sure I vaguely recall it, and I'm pretty sure
Okay, well, what happened, they decided that someone had a bright idea of putting on this live show from the studio with Albion fans there, and having me and Archer in the studio, telling them what was going on in the mediation. And this was right in the middle of the mediation, which was not a good idea. And I said to the mediators, no way should we go on this program. I know how the media operate, and so they agreed. And on the Friday afternoon, the show was on Sunday afternoon. On the Friday afternoon, Archer and I signed an affidavit saying that we would not appear on this show, which was countersigned and witnessed by these two mediators. Cut to the Sunday afternoon, 2:00, right? In the studio, in Southampton, welcome to the show. Here we have a range of Brighton supporters. Unfortunately, we invited Mr. Knight, to come on the show, but he declined. However, I'm glad to say, over to our Granada studios in Manchester, cut to this Archer sitting in the studio with an eye patch on. I mean, you couldn't make it up. He's got an eye patch on for the sympathy vote. And so this compere of this show was all over Archer, saying, thank you, Bill, for agreeing to come on our show. And obviously Archer thought, well, I've really scored the Albion fans in the studio were virtually all booing and hissing. They were just kept under control, really. But I can tell you, he did not do himself any favors with the mediators, because they thought, if this guy can sign a sworn affidavit and 2 days later break it, he's capable of doing anything, which of course he was. So, he completely undermined his position by doing that. But it was hilarious, because who represented the Brighton club? Guess. Scally. He came on the show representing the Brighton club. It was just, and the reason he was there was because his wife at that time was the daughter of a Brighton legend. That's what they said on the show, right? So people in the audience, the Brighton fans are in, they were saying, well, who is the legend? And so the presenter said his name is Peter O'Donnell, or some name like that no one had ever heard of. And it turned out, I mean, I would sort of vaguely remember this name, and it turned out he played 16 games for Brighton over about 2 seasons or 3 seasons. According to the Southern TV people, he was a legend, an Albion legend. I know they give that title out frequently to all sorts of people, including me. But in this case, he really wasn't a legend. But that was their justification for having Scally there. And all he was doing was promoting the cause of Gillingham. you know, and how generous they were to allow Brighton to go and play there. I mean, you couldn't make it up, except there it was, and the evidence of your eyes was there. Anyway, that's the end of that bit. What else do you want to talk about?
Honestly, I couldn't get anything worse than having to deal with him. Both of them, to be honest. I don't know how you managed it.
Well, I think what happened, Aaron, was that he used to call me a chancer because it was his phrase for, you know, soft southern bastards, as he, you know, basically felt all people from the south of England were somehow not as good as him, you know, and strong as him. And he was a tough northern businessman who knew how to, you know, put a shovel in the ground and all that. You know, he was a tough. He thought he was a real macho guy, you know, but he was a tough. And you know, I'm sure he was quite a good businessman, but you know, he could but hide behind a corkscrew, as far as I was concerned, in terms of, you know, trusting what he said, because he'd agree something. I mean, the negotiations that I had with him before this mediation thing started, I mean, that was 4 months after the negotiations had actually started, because I would meet with him in London, and he'd agree something, and then so we'd like, yes, you can see the books, and then he would not make them available. So you'd meet up with him again and say, well, no, I didn't really agree. I didn't definitely agree to that. He'd make it up as he went along. He was just stalling to hope that I'd go away. But he picked the wrong person there, because I wasn't going away. The more I dealt with him, the more I was certain I was going to win, ultimately get rid of him, you know. So, but it was pretty, I mean, in all the the advertising business is a very, you know, highly competitive business, and it's very, you know, it's high octane sort of thing. But in all my time in advertising, which is 30 years, working at the very top level in London and New York, I never met anybody as devious as Bill Archer in all that time in business. He was that bad. You know, you couldn't trust what he said. It was just impossible. And he kept making these promises to the fans, but after 2 or 3 times when nothing happened, of course they all distrusted him, and Bellotti was just a figurehead. He never was involved in any of the discussion in negotiations I had with Archer, because Archer treated him like a puppet. You know, you'll speak when I tell you to speak. And he was the one who was getting all the flack down here, because Archer installed him from being an MP, because he thought he had power, you know, in the corridors of power on the south coast. But Bellotti didn't have any power, and he was inept, aspiring to be incompetent, or the other way around. He was incompetent, aspiring to be inept. Either way, he was pretty useless as a chief executive. The only way he dealt with it was by batting people the whole time, you know. So countless Albion fans, certainly people like the Argus seller who'd sold the Argus for 30 years at the Goldstone, was banned for some reason, maybe because the paper was criticizing the club, you know, which they don't do now, but in those days there was a lot to criticize the club about. You know, anyway, the point is that you know, he was a very tricky customer to deal with. You just had to hang on, but not hang on. I mean, you know, it was quite clear to him. He realized that he was going to lose in the end. He knew I wasn't going away, and you know, he ceremoniously, I gave him a check for £56.25, and Greg Stanley, because they set up this company called 4A565 with £100 equity, only £100 worth of share value, and 56.25% was owned by Archer, and the other 43% or whatever was owned by Greg Stanley, and I gave both of them checks for that amount. And Archer never cashed his, but Greg Stanley did. I mean, it's just brilliant. Even Archer wasn't going to cash that because it was a PR, own goal by Greg Stanley to do that. Obviously. Anyway, interesting times.